I thought I would start today and introduce this particular approach to conflict studies, to conflict analysis, and by implications, conflict practice, with a little story. I've known Catherine a long time, and I don't think you probably even know this, Catherine. Do you know why I'm here, how I got to Syracuse? No. Okay, so here's the story. And it's a story of a failure, right? Everybody talks about the best experiences in your life, the most important, are sometimes things you fail miserably at. So when I first got my master's degree, I don't know, I was about 22 years old, and I moved to Boston, and I was lucky enough to get into this field for the first time. And I was hired by a nonprofit organization called the Center for Policy Negotiation, and they had just gotten a big grant from the Hewlett Foundation and from DuPont, the chemical company, and from a combination of a few environmental groups to hold an off-the-record, what they call policy dialogue on the issue of climate change. And this was the early 1990s, so, or it was the late 1980s. Anyways, the first George Bush was president, and it was the beginning of people realizing that climate change was a serious problem. There was ideas for legislation. It was the first global summit. So there was a lot going on around the issue of what is this huge problem we're facing? How are we going to possibly deal with it? And so the Hewlett Foundation and DuPont, which had a lot to lose, and environmental groups who really wanted to move forward an aggressive climate policy, decided to give the organization that I work for some money to bring together all the stakeholders off the record to talk through climate change with the goal of, well, maybe instead of having legislation and lawsuits and a very public process of working out how is the United States going to respond to climate change, we can see if we could develop an off-the-record, consensus-based position on what to do about climate change, and that then could become the basis for legislation moving forward. And actually at the time, John Sununu, who was the chief of staff for the first President Bush, he was all very interested in this. So he had gotten involved, and we were all very excited. Great, we're going to bring together members of the auto industry, the chemical industry, environmental groups, scientists, labor unions. We're going to meet in Washington over a period of 2 years, have this dialogue, and on the other side of this dialogue, we're going to have a piece of consensus-based agreement on what to do. My dream job. I thought I was in heaven. So, of course, it failed miserably, right? We got everybody to come at the beginning, and there were probably it was a meeting every 2 months, and so there were probably about 3 very successful meetings where we would have different people coming and talking about climate change. And then I noticed people were stopping returning my phone calls. And this dream of kind of working towards a common consensus-based position on what to do really wasn't happening. And that when we were able to bring people in the room, there was just a lot of arguing taking place. And every time we pushed them towards, you're going to talk about interest-based negotiation later in this semester, every time we pushed them towards coming up with an interest-based solution that reflected everybody, it was not gaining any traction. So it got worse and worse, and then the thing just fell apart. And it was a huge waste of money. And my first big chance to prove what a smart guy I was and have this really first great job just was a miserable experience. But the good news is that made me get really interested in why did this fall apart? What did we misdiagnose about the nature of this conflict that was making it so hard to get people together and talk? And what might we have done differently if I could go back in time to make this a more successful experience? And what I began to get interested in, that I'm still really interested, is that yes, people have interests and they have positions and we can transform those things. Yes, we have to get to negotiated settlements based on facts and ideas. But what was inhibiting conversation was the fact that the people in the room had completely different worldviews, completely different belief structures. And we didn't take the time to engage in an exploration of what do you believe, for instance, about the human species and what kind of future we should be aspiring for? What do you believe about the relationship between human beings and nature? What do you believe about technology? Do you think technology is a role for good in society or a role for bad or something that's neutral? And looking back, I realized one of the reasons that the dialogue fell apart is because we never engaged in that discussion about beliefs and worldviews early on, people were just talking past each other. They were talking a different language. They were talking using different metaphors, and they were talking from very different assumptions about the nature of their relationship to Earth and what climate change meant. So I tell you this story to start this conversation today about social psychological traditions because that story to me and all the readings you did for this week very much point to the commonality across this approach to conflict studies that is social psychological, interested in beliefs and worldviews. So what did all the readings today have in common? What's the commonality? Catherine started off today saying, you know, we're doing these different approaches. This is one distinct approach, social psychological, cognitive approaches to conflict studies. What are all the readings? What do you think is the commonality across all the work? Social psychological approaches to conflict.
Framing.
Okay, so say a little bit more about that.
So how you approach the conflict, how you view it in your own philosophy of what you think should happen or how do you think the outcome should be, and it's really how you sell it to other people or the lens that you look at it through.
Okay, I like that lens, how you sell it. That's kind of a cynical approach, right? But yeah, so climate is partly selling things. Who else? Yeah.
There are different narratives that emphasize or de-emphasize different aspects of a situation or an issue that tend to suggest the correct path or suggest a cause of an issue, although it's not necessarily the only interpretation. It's just an emphasis or a de-emphasis of certain aspects.
Okay, so when you say narrative, say a little bit more about what you mean. What is a narrative?
So a narrative is a story. It's sort of, it could be a fable, but it's an explanation of the sequence of events or the way things happen that sort of support the policy outcome or social outcome or whatever solution or thing you think you need to accomplish. Okay,
so you're saying our stories about a conflict connect our analysis of what it's about to a particular solution. It's almost like a pathway. Anybody else? Yeah.
How you position your argument and justify the actions that you're advocating for or that you're about to take, regardless.
Okay, so can you position it in facts? Do facts have anything to do with social psychological approaches?
You choose the facts that are ideal to fit your frame.
But aren't there just one set of facts that are true for everybody? Well, how do we deal with that problem? There are facts, right? There are no facts?
I don't think so.
There's no such thing as something that is true to all people, all places, everywhere, at all times? What do you think?
Based on the reading, I thought that the leaders, the actor of the institution,
Yep.
make a frame for a fact or evidence or condition, the real condition,
Mm-hmm.
and based on the frame that the leaders make, it influence the policy and every strategy that all the nation or all institute will do in daily life, like when the terrorism was thought that this is the war of the war on terror, so all the policy and everything and the journalism and yeah.
Okay.
based on that
Great example. So that brings it back to the narrative, right? So even a single word, like the word war in your example, brings to mind a whole bunch of associations that suggest one pathway for action is more appropriate than another pathway. Once you define something as a war, that's connected to a set of actions. So that first step initially of framing it as a war turns out to be one of the most important things you could possibly do to direct future action. Okay, and I also heard, did you say interpretation? Yeah, interpretation. So this notion that, yes, there are facts everywhere. And the more complex the issue, the more complex the facts, and maybe the more contested the facts, and the more that interpretation becomes important to understanding what's going on and to tell a story.
I think one of the texts also talked about that each side of a conflict constructs a social reality. So I think maybe as a solution, kind of, we should not look for truth or facts or reality,
Right.
but for bringing positions together, or like interests maybe in this case,
Yeah.
and see what is the common ground of the parties here.
And there was my mistake for climate change, right? I think the assumption a lot of times in problem solving is that we can get to a truth. And so we had scientists come in and give the data, right? Tell the story. Thinking that surely enough, if we provide enough data and background, everyone will get to the basement, the ground floor of facts they can agree on, get rid of all this emotional worldview stuff. We don't need it, right? Because there's a truth under there, and if we find that truth, we can build on it and create optimal solutions. And my misdiagnosis was that cluttering the ability to find the truth was that you can't find truth through narrative, through subjective understanding of how the world works, what people are like, where we should be going. So, yeah. So, what all the readings have in common, and to me, what distinguishes social psychological cognitive approaches to conflict studies that's different from any of the other approaches that you will be studying this semester is the notion that every conflict is interpreted through a subjective lens. That we don't ever see the world out there as it truly is. The world we see and the conflicts we see are a product of our own frames, worldviews, cognitions, narrative, lens, script, construct, assumptive world, culture, identity. These are all words that scholars use to basically say the same thing. That what conflict are you going to study this semester?
Cuomo's take on education.
Cuomo's take on education, so a great example. So this approach would say we can't really understand the conflict over education. And the big conflict there is he wants lots of things. He wants to bust the unions, right, or reduce tenure, or have more testing. There's tax issues, right? So social psychological approaches would be, if you're going to understand that conflict, you have to understand what happens between here and here. The information coming in and being interpreted and coming out the other side as a construct, as an idea of what's happening. And this is a huge, long tradition in philosophy across all time, right? I mean, do you remember reading, did any of you read Plato's allegory of the cave when you were younger? What was that story about? The allegory of the cave, a famous Platonic, is that right? Platonic? Plato-ish, famous story by Plato. Do you remember it? Tracy, you remember it? Who remembers the allegory of the cave? What was the essential aspect of that story, the essential teaching Plato was saying about the nature of reality? Yes, Laura.
If I remember correctly, because it's been a while, there was someone in the cave, and all they could see were the shadows on the wall that was made by the light coming through, and then they stepped out of the cave and into the light, and they were totally blinded by the light because they had never experienced anything but the shadows that had been cast.
Right. Great story. So they were actually prisoners, shackled in a cave, only facing one direction, with the light from a fire behind them. And so their interpretation of the world, of what's going on, were simply the shadows cast by the fire on the wall. And Plato's, that allegory, but Plato was basically saying we're all prisoners, right? And we're all shackled, and we're shackled to the fact that we can never see the fire directly. And if we did, we would be overwhelmed, because the complexity of the world, the complexity of all the information and sights and sounds and ideas and facts and everything can never be taken in all at once and seen truly as it is by everybody. So we create the world through our own constructs, lenses, culture, frames. We give it meaning. And that's how we see. That's how we see. Okay. So I'll prove this to you. I'll prove that we do this automatically as a matter of course all the time. I'm going to show you a series of pictures. And for each picture I show you, I want you just in your head, not out loud, for a second to say to yourself, this is a story about, and try to interpret that picture. And I'm going to run through them pretty quickly. I'll do it. Okay, so here's the point of all of this. And when I say I'm going to prove that you do that, what I mean by that is that I don't have to tell you the story, right? You don't need me to say, well, let me explain to you what's happening in this picture. In a blink of an eye, all of you access something, some kind of understanding in your head to interpret each of those pictures. And there's probably as many stories about each of those pictures as there are people in this room. And if I was to take the time to deeply probe how you felt about what your reaction was, what things you thought about, what images you had, what meaning you gave to each of those pictures, I would get a rich array of interpretations of those things that each pulls from a slightly different angle to give that meaning. So we're interested in today in determining that process, how that occurs, and what to do about it. If conflicts are partly about the fact that we all do it differently, in a blink of an eye, automatically, what implications does that have for conflict management practice? Okay, so what I was calling social psychological traditions, or in that Venn diagram that you used for this class, what I would call the cognitive approach to conflict. To me, there's two related dynamics that are the most important theoretical traditions, things to know about from this perspective. And the first one here you're going to talk about next week, right? So the first one is the notion of identity. And there's a whole strain of thought in the field called social identity theory that looks at how our identities, our sense of who we are, our internal stories of kind of membership in groups, out groups, how that triggers conflict and how we might deal with identity. Related to this, but different, that we're going to talk about today, is this idea of framing. That we should really understand, how do we frame conflicts? Anytime you're doing a diagnosis of a conflict, all the conflicts you're going to look at for the papers you're doing, all of you should be looking at the stakeholder groups who are involved in those conflicts and trying to figure out, how do they frame that conflict? How do they make sense of it? Because unless you understand the frames that the stakeholders use, you're never going to be able to really understand what's going on. Okay. Framing conflicts, conflicts over framing. We went into this a little bit before, but somebody give me a definition. What is a frame? Commonly used in social sciences, this notion of frames.
Maybe a reduction of perspective.
That's interesting. A frame is a reduction of perspective. So say a little bit more about that. Meaning, you're saying frames actually are an exclusion, a boiling down of something rather than an opening up to see it. So tell me a little bit more what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think like a perspective can have a lot of different elements and parts of your views and include different beliefs, values, experiences, history. And by framing it, I think you try to cut off certain of, or to reduce some of these, or this perspective to a limited number maybe, or a limited size of these elements. I don't know. It's a bit hard to explain.
Okay, you're doing a great job. And fortunately, we have a camera in the room, right? So not only did you do a great job forever, right? Everyone will see that great job. But the camera itself is a perfect example of what a frame is. So the camera, what's your name? Melissa has moved the camera to frame the image of what's going on in this room in a particular way as you were responding. Melissa will move the camera back to me. And Melissa is making choices all the time right now about what to include, how wide to open, is it called the aperture? How wide to open the aperture of the camera. Should I include Catherine Gerard sitting there? Should I not include Catherine? Should we include the PowerPoint? Should we include all of you? Should we try to get out the window, right? So we know that it's cold and we can see the ice. And the point is that these are choices, and all of these things, these choices, reduce complexity, right? Point us in the direction of here's how to see things. If you see Catherine in the picture, maybe in the back of your head that framing says, he's not in charge. There's the real power of the group. If Catherine's not in the picture, I'm the power. If you're in the picture, maybe you're triggering the notion that this is a participatory exercise, right? Oh, this is how things happen at Syracuse University. It's a circle. Oh, what does it mean to have a classroom that's in a circle? All of those choices, they seem mundane, but all of them, just like the series of photographs I showed you, all of them trigger these stories automatically. Why do we need to do that? Because people who study framing say, like Plato, we do that automatically and we can't not do that. We could not live in a world where we're not framing all the time. Are you framing right now? Toria, are you framing at this moment?
Absolutely.
Anything in particular you're framing as you're listening to me?
I'm going to write my paper for my thesis capstone.
Okay. And when I just put you on the spot and called out your name and said, what are you doing? I guarantee Vittoria was framing automatically and subconsciously because she has a whole narrative about what it means to be a student, what it means to talk to a professor, what it means to be in this context. And when I say, why would the argument be we frame all the time and we have to, it's a survival instinct. Because Vittoria, as a social being, has learned all the context of all sorts of things, and in order to behave appropriately, she frames the situation because until she frames it, she does not know how to act. It's that idea from Plato, right? If we walked out into the light, we would be blinded. We would be blinded because there would be so much chaos, so much information, so many different ways of seeing what's going on. We wouldn't possibly know what to do. So frames precede action. There's no such thing as action without some kind of framing. Okay. You can keep going. There it is. So this is the definition I like the best from Sandra Kaufman. I think you've got a couple readings this semester that are on that great website Beyond Intractability, the University of Colorado. So I pulled this one off of Sandra Kaufman's write-up of what frames are. And she says, frames are cognitive shortcuts that people use to make sense of complex information. And the more complex the information, the more shortcuts we need. I'll talk about that in a second. I'll talk about it now for a second. Cognitive shortcuts. So this goes back to the idea that every human being is what social psychologists call a cognitive miser. A cognitive miser. We like to do the least amount of work possible to make sense of the world. And so we do that by framing. Frames help us to interpret the world around us and represent that world to others, okay? Second important point. Not only do we need frames, not only does Vittoria need a frame in order to respond, to know how to respond appropriately in a student-teacher relationship, right? But for conflicts, she represents the world. We actively promote our own frames. No. Here's how to see it. They help us organize complex phenomena into coherent, understandable categories. Thus, frames provide meaning through selective simplification by filtering people's perception and providing them with a field of vision for a problem. A great example I like to use is, I hope I didn't use this when I would talk to you before. Give me a, if I did. Ronald Reagan and the Contras? Good, okay. So I remember the first conflict I was really aware of as a political being was when I was a senior in high school and then freshman in college, and it was the revolution, the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. Okay, so this was a time when it was still the middle of the Cold War, and so the United States' primary foreign policy concern was the Soviet Union, an expansion of Soviet influence in spheres of influence that traditionally the United States controlled. And one of the big hotspots was Latin America, because there weren't a lot of, other than Cuba, there weren't a lot of communist Soviet footholds in Latin America. And so there was a big revolution in Nicaragua, and this political party, Marxist party called the Sandinistas, took over the government, and the United States was terrified. Oh no, communism in Central America, what are we going to do? So Ronald Reagan and his advisors decided to start a somewhat covert campaign to fund counter-revolutionaries in the jungles of Nicaragua to do attacks on various Sandinista facilities to try to destabilize the government, okay? To bring back America's influence in Nicaragua, to stop the revolution and turn it around. And initially, when they referred to these counter-revolutionaries, the word that they used was the Contras. So there would be a press conference. And Reagan would say, the Contras, today the brave Contras did this. The United States is supporting a brave band of Contras. The press would call them the Contras. The Contras, the Contras, the Contras. Now when I say the word Contra, what do you think of in your head?
Counter.
Okay, counter, yeah. Is it a good name? Contra? What the heck's a contra? It's counter, it's contra to a contradiction. It's not a name you can get behind, right? So Reagan had this brilliant, or his advisors had a brilliant idea. instead of referring to them to the Contras, we're going to start to refer to them as freedom fighters. Today, the brave freedom fighters did this. The United States is supporting the freedom fighters in the jungles of Nicaragua. And when I say freedom fighter, what do you think of? America. I'll tell you what I think of. I grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, home of the Revolution. I think of those brave colonialists who fought those horrible British oppressive authoritarians in here, and we did the revolution, and we independence, and Yankee Doodle Dandy, and Paul Revere, and Sam Adams, and all of those things. I've got this whole story of freedom fighters and what it means. And I automatically, when I hear the word freedom fighter, I have a completely different association that I apply to my cognitive miser self. How do I make, who are these people? What are they doing there? What are they about? Oh, Bruce, you don't have to know anything. All you have to know is that they're freedom fighters. Oh, now I know. And if there's freedom fighters, I support them, right? That's a frame. That's the power of words. Where do you think these frames come from, by the way? What are they a product of? If it's true that we're framing it at every moment, you're framing now, that anytime you read about a conflict or a story, you're framing. Every time you have a fight with your partner or a child or social interactions, you're framing. So where do they come from? Where do you imagine?
They come from your past experiences, and a lot of times your deep-held values or maxims that you hold to be true. A lot of times you don't even know you hold them to be true until you self-assess yourself and realize why something.
Okay, so a couple things, really important points. Sometimes we're not aware of them, right? So the way we frame the world is unconscious. I'll talk about that in a second. And then you're giving two sources. One, frames are a product of experiences. You stick your hand in the fire, it's hot, you pull it out, and you never stick your hand in the fire again, right? So every time we have a social experience, we are using that experience to frame what will happen next time. The other thing you're saying is values, right? They come from our values. Where do the values come from? Culture? Are they passed on through parents? Sorry? Education.
For me, frame is a structure of your belief, perception, and appreciation.
Okay, so right, I love that word, a structure. It's a structure of belief. It's a set of doorways in your brain and memories in your brain that open up and create neural pathways and associations, again, in the blink of an eye. Yeah?
I wouldn't say that it's something that we are just exposed to, like we are not independent from our frames. They don't just happen to us. We also use them to manipulate other people.
Okay, we use them to manipulate other people. Yes, thank you for that segue. That is perfect. Because when I think about framing and when I look at frames, to me there's two very different kinds of framing techniques that are going on in conflicts. The first is frames are subconscious, right? We are not aware of them. There's certain of those frames that start at the basement. They're the make sense way that we walk through life, and we may not be manipulating anybody. They just are kind of our worldview, deep held values, and those ones are relatively immune from change. There's some ways we see the world that are just part of who we are from the moment we're born. So I always use this picture just because it's such a great example of framing and the difference in framing that, have you all seen this picture before? It's kind of a famous picture, right? And the point of this picture is there's two images in one picture. There's I think misogynistically it's referred to as the old hag and the young maiden. So I won't use those phrases. I'll say if you see the old woman, here's her nose, here's her mouth, here's her chin, right? She's got a wart on her nose, and that's her eye. Do you all see the old woman? Okay. If you see the young woman, okay, don't look here. She's turned away from the camera. That's her ear. That's the tip of her nose, and here's her chin. And that's her bonnet. Can everyone see both? Anyone not see both? What can't you see, Christian?
The old woman.
You can't see the old woman. Keep looking. Go home tonight. Study it. Dream about it. Eventually, you'll see the old woman. It's a cheap trick to show you the essential point of framing, that sometimes unconsciously, and who knows why, some of us visually, immediately, if we've never seen this picture before and haven't had to try to look, visually we immediately see one instead of the other. And the point is, that's what these deep subconscious frames are like, right? We immediately see one thing rather than another. Yeah?
But does it mean there is a reality, but any human being will never ever experience it because you always have subconscious frames?
Are you saying?
I was just wondering that, because does it say like there is just no reality actually, or truth maybe, because everyone is framing and we are human beings, or I don't know.
Taken to the extreme, that's exactly what it means. That we have certain things that we agree on as deep-seated cultural human delusions, right? And that we coalesce our belief systems around thinking this is how the world is. And those are meta constructs that human beings use to walk through the world. Taken to an extreme, people who promote this theory would say there's no such thing as truth under there. We're all just products of, I mean, if you think about what we see, we have, how many senses do we have? 5, 4? I don't even remember. 6 senses. Maybe we do, right? But we're products of evolutionary forces on Earth that have given us senses to see reality. On a different planet, under different conditions, speculation is evolutionary forces would shape those beings and those entities in completely different ways, maybe with other senses that we're not even aware of. So taken to the extreme, you could say that human beings, just by the nature of our evolutionary processes and how we see the world, have these core senses that we use, and we treat them as truth, but they're not truth. Now, you can run that up the flagpole and say, well, maybe that's true, and then maybe there's some culturally agreed upon frames that we don't much question. And then you get into trouble, well, what about scientific facts, right? Water boils at 212 degrees at sea level everywhere on Earth. Can I say that's not true? Can I say that's a frame? Well, that's harder. So it's messy, right? It's fun to think about, and it's definitely messy. So to me, these are the kind of the subconscious frames. The way some of you are keying in on framing, and in conflicts, it makes complete sense to also think of framing as strategic manipulations of stories that are beneficial to our wants, desires, and interests. So in a conflict, you find yourself always saying, no, here's how to think of it. You're thinking about it the wrong way. And has anyone ever read a book called Policy Paradox by Deborah Stone? If you're in public policy, if you study public policy, it's a really big book. And her argument is that politics and political decision-making, she studies the US government, but it applies anywhere. She says all politics is a process of strategic argumentation, meaning that the traditional rational choice model of decision-making, of political decision-making, when you have a tough public policy problem, education, right? Good example. The traditional rational choice model that is favored by a lot of economists and political scientists is, what are the best policies that we come up to deal with the education problem? They're rationally derived. We carefully study all the evidence, we select out the truth, we figure out collectively what's the truth, and then we apply a policy that optimizes the benefits in light of the problem that we've diagnosed. And Deborah Stone came along with this book, Policy Paradox, and she said, that's a bunch of, I'm on camera, nonsense, right? That's not what happens. It's strategically crafted argumentation. All politics is Cuomo telling a story about education and unions and children, and another stakeholder telling a different story about education, children, and unions, and another stakeholder telling a story about towns struggling in central New York. And all of them are vying for the public to accept their story as the truth. Politicians try to, have you ever listened to a presidential debate in this country? Presidential debates are simply, here's how to see this issue. No, here's how to see this issue. No, here's how to see this issue. Let me tell you the story about this issue. Margaret Jones is in the audience right now. Margaret has a 7-year-old daughter who was born with a disability. And the cameras go to Margaret. And here our framing, right? Our storytelling, our sense-making is going. And whoever tells the story that is the winning story shapes the policy. Yeah?
So it's just like glorified marketing. You're trying to sell your product, you're going to frame it in the best way so that the largest audience is going to accept your product the way you want them to.
Yeah.
So you're trying to get them to buy into your product.
Yeah, cynically, it's no different from a commercial, right? Commercials never say, buy this car because we want to make money, right? That's what it's about. We want to make money for our stakeholders. So you're not buying a car to make money for or stockholders. Yeah, you're buying it because you'll feel young again. You're an old dude like me, and if you drive that car, you're going to get this feeling, and people are going to pay attention to you, and you'll feel young. That's what they're selling. That's strategically crafted argumentation. It's a very cynical view of politics, but it makes sense. And I've got these marvelous 2 quotes to kind of show you that in practice. This is a little dated, but I still use it because it's so good. One by Hillary Clinton when she was a senator, and one by Tom Tancredo, who is no longer, this was when he was a representative from, I think, Colorado. And it was during a time when illegal immigration was a big debate. It is now 2, right? But this was maybe the first big round of it. And they were having all these speeches. And Tom Tancredo says, illegal immigration is a scourge that threatens the very future of the nation. What's a scourge? I heard somebody say it.
Disease.
Yes. Pestilence, disease. You picture bed bugs sweeping up and climbing into your hair, and other people getting sick, and you communicable diseases. That's a scourge, right? This is a strategically selected term. What is illegal immigration like? It's like a disease. Ugh. Must be bad then, right? Yeah. And then Hillary Clinton stands up and says something different. Republicans, like Tom, their immigration reforms would literally criminalize the Good Samaritan and probably even Jesus himself. And then you say, oh, you mean Jesus would be against Republican immigration reforms? It's a pretty good bet. If Jesus is against it, that's the way to go. Right? So I'm going to go with Republican illegal immigration reforms being bad. Good Samaritan is a reference to one of the stories in, I don't remember, is that the New Testament? So a biblical reference. Strategically crafted argumentation. Deep-seated subconscious frames, yes. Changeable, highly manipulated frames at a higher level, that too. Okay. So let's bring it home. What does this have to do with conflict? Should be pretty clear by now. So who wants to say it? Is that a volunteer? Is that a volunteer? Are you raising your hand?
Well, it's an easy
Mm-hmm.
Follow us, this is the consequences,
Mm-hmm.
politicians, I have this great plan that's going to save the nation,
Mm-hmm.
so it's their way of putting that frame out, making it for you,
Mm-hmm.
putting that frame in place that they want to manipulate your thoughts and feelings to follow their.
Okay, good, good. So why should we be so interested in framing when it comes to conflict? Why do we need to understand frames when it comes to
I think
conflict?
it's important because you need to understand how people are approaching the conflict. If you can understand that, you might be able to figure out how to work toward a resolution or something that can help resolve it.
Why? Why does understanding framing help with resolution? Or we don't use resolution, right? We use transformation. Why? Do I really have to know the way you see the world in order to transform my conflict with you, Carrie?
Yes. If you can zero in on the frame, or at least understand how things are being framed, you can try and hone in on the interest behind it.
Okay, so frames help us understand interests. That's good. Rose?
Frames would give us the opportunity to be able to find ways of restructuring or reframing or reforming this conflict, since it can be solved, but the frame can lead to what needs to be put in place. Well, sort of like a lead to be able to
Right.
transform the conflict.
Right, great. So not only are you saying that frames, every conflict is a contest over framing, but you're also saying conflict transformation may require then a new frame. If we're going to deal with conflicts that are really over, back to my climate change example, if it's about the role of technology, maybe, or the future of human beings or a relationship with nature, maybe we can never reconcile those things, but maybe the first step we have to have in any kind of dialogue is putting those things on the table, acknowledging them so we can understand the interests of the other side. And maybe we can reconcile those frames and reframe. We'll talk about that in a second. Maybe we can't. We've got a great example here. I hope I didn't talk about this book before, Side by Side. Good, okay. So I love this book. One of my graduate students gave it to me as a gift. It's the kind of gifts you get when you're in this business. So it's called Side by Side, and it was co-edited by an Israeli academic and a Palestinian academic. And what they did is they looked at all of the textbooks that Palestinian children read in schools that tell about historical events, and then all the textbooks that Israeli students read about in schools that tell about historical events, and hence the name Side by Side. On each page of this book, they have the Israeli textbook explanation of the event and the Palestinian explanation of the event. So I just picked one that I think is great. And I'll read a couple excerpts from the explanation of the Six-Day War of June 5th through 10th, 1967. So that's the title of the chapter. I'll read the Israeli side first. The title of the section of the textbook is called The Six-Day War, June 5th through 10th, 1967. During the years that preceded the Six-Day War, Israel was busy addressing serious problems that had confronted the nation since its founding. It suffered infiltration of terrorists from Arab states and the murder of civilians, shelling from Syria, and the military threat from Egypt, and responded to attacks on the citizens with retaliatory action. Then they go on. Beginning in 1964, tensions between Syria and Israel increased when Syria began to construction designed to divert water from a source of the Jordan River to cut off the flow to the Sea of Galilee. It's important to note that the Sea of Galilee is Israel's only freshwater reservoir. It feeds the national aqueduct that supplies water to all the towns and villages of the Negev Desert. Between 1965 and 1967, encouraged by Syria, Palestinian incursions from Jordan into Israel became more frequent. The Jordanian government did not stop the terrorists who used the territory as a base from which to launch strikes at Israeli soldiers and civilians, injuring many. In May of 1967, following Syria's demand that Egypt take action against Israel, Egyptian President Nasser took the following steps. He declared full military alert and sent massive troops and weapons to the Sinai. He blocked the Straits of Tiran, Israeli shipping effectively cutting off Israel from Asia and Africa. On the same day, at a widely publicized meeting with Egyptian pilots, Nasser called for war, declaring, "The Jews believe in war, and we are telling them, welcome, we are prepared for war." Okay, so I'm an Israeli student. Oh, okay. Now I understand that. Now I understand how this messy thing happened. Meanwhile, only a few miles away on the other side of the green zone, in Area C or whatever it's called, the section that Palestinian kids are reading is called Israeli Aggression Against Arab and Palestinian Lands. And here's how they explain the same event. The war which Israel waged against Arab countries in 1967 is known in the Arab world as the aggression of June the 5th, because it was Israel that first declared and started the war. By definition, aggression is an unprovoked initiation of the use of power by one country to attack or invade the lands of another. According to the 1933 Armistice Conference, an aggressor is, quote, the party which declares war on another country and invades its land through military power, end quote. Aggression is defined as an attack which opposes the right which aims at invalidating demilitarized zones as defined in international agreements. Israel had always been preparing for an attack on the Palestinian lands. It was always on alert and closely followed international and Arabic conditions to find the right moment to wage the attack against the Arab countries. According, when work on the diversion, this canal, started in November, Israel's artillery and tanks began non-stop shelling of the work site. As a result, work on the canal stopped as the Arab countries felt they were not prepared to go to war. Israel continued to take all of the water of the Jordan to provide it to settlements, while the Arabs received nothing. Sporadic clashes in the Syrian-Israeli border created serious tensions. The frontline Syrian forces fired on Israelis who were trying to farm lands in the demilitarized zones and on fishing boats that repeatedly crossed the armistice line. Syria's artillery in the Golan Heights occasionally shelled Israeli settlements in reaction to shelling of Syrian military positions. And it goes on. There's framing. History, right? Have you heard that phrase, history is something about the victors? History is written by the victors, right? We all write our own history, and we write history in a way that brings it into focus by excluding information and including other information. That's framing, and that is the nature of every conflict, is an effort to frame it in one way rather than another. So you might say that when is framing particularly important? I would say in every single one of the conflicts you're studying this semester, you will be able to find framing differences. The question is, some conflicts, framing is a really salient driver of the conflict, whereas in other conflicts, you can find framing differences, but they may not be that salient. If you're going to try to address or transform the conflict, it might not be the first place you would start. If I go buy a car and I'm in conflict with the salesperson trying to sell me the car, I could certainly do academic research and write a long paper on the differences, the framing differences between the way I understand buying a car and the way that the salesperson understands buying a car. I could write a dissertation on it if I wanted. But as a matter of saliency or relevance, framing differences exist, but they're not that salient to really understanding the nature of intractability. I might want to look elsewhere. Whereas in other conflicts, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, framing differences appear to be highly salient to the escalation and possible de-escalation of the conflict. So one way to think about it is that if this is framing conflicts or conflicts over frames, and this is low-high, and this is uncertainty, meaning the facts are contested there's wider room to interpret what's going on, low, high. This is probably the general relationship you would expect. As uncertainty around an issue increases, as there's more room to fill in the blanks and tell a story of what's happening, you're more likely to see framing conflicts increase, become more salient. My climate change example is a great example, particularly at the time that I was doing the climate change dialogue, because the science was very uncertain. And even now, even though most scientists agree completely that climate change is real, it's an incredibly complex set of relationships between carbon in the oceans, carbons in trees, periodic cycles in the sun. There's all sorts of models that have to happen. It's messy. There's a lot of uncertainty. And the more uncertainty there is, the more it's possible for the climate, some people call them deniers, to marshal some kind of evidence that all appears reasonable to say, no, there's no climate change. And here's why. There's so much uncertainty. Look it. I will paint you a picture. And for a lot of people, they read that picture and they say, yeah, that's right. Creationism. Well, no, I won't go there. But creationism is very interesting, right? Most scientists believe in evolutionary processes of human development, human evolution, but many people do not believe in it. Creationists do not believe it. They believe much more in a kind of a religious or biblical explanation for how we came to be here. Why does that persist despite the science and the fossils and all? Because it's messy. Because there's so much room for interpreting what's going on. We can tell very different stories, appealing to different anchors. And each story may seem as legitimate as any other story. All right, last section. So, implications for practice. We just did diagnostics. You're looking at a conflict, you're trying to figure out what is driving this conflict. Is it different interests? Is it structural inequalities? Is it emotional? Is it cognitive? Is it beliefs? And if you have a conflict that your diagnostic, as the expert you're all becoming, your diagnostics of that conflict says, this one really is driven to a large extent by differences in framing. I can't approach this conflict and try to transform it without somehow coping with these deep framing differences. Okay, if that's your situation, if that's your conflict, what are the implications for practice? How do you do that? What is the treatment, the antidote, the management, the constructive management for conflicts that are driven to a large extent by differences in framing? We know the destructive pathway. The destructive pathway is just stick to your story. You're wrong, I'm right. You're wrong, I'm right. And then fight and die over it. Oh, can you go back, Catherine? That's why I love this quote by George Orwell, right? That's the destructive management of framing conflicts. We're all capable of believing things which we know to be untrue. Delusion of I want to see this issue as this way, not the other way. And then when we're finally proved wrong, imprudently twisting the facts so as to show that we were right. Intellectually, it's possible to carry on this process for an indefinite time. The only check on it is that sooner or later a false belief bumps up against a solid reality, usually on a battlefield. Great quote. One more? So, tell me. Conflict managers. What do we do when a conflict is driven by really deep differences in these these frames? Give me an intervention. Rose. Sorry? Okay, third-party involvement. Sure, and why would that be? Why are third parties particularly important in framing conflicts that are driven by framing differences?
Well, I'm looking at it from the angle that they frame themselves and they're rigid in their stance. And would probably not be willing to even see or sit to discuss. So a third party would probably be a good strategy to try and broker some kind of
Makes sense, okay? So if people are telling different stories, and their stories, as you're going to find out next week, are deeply attached to their sense of identity, right? And their ability to, I know how to navigate the world. I navigate the world through this story. And if you change stories, it feels like you're naked. Changing the underlying fundamental structure of what I believe to be true? I'm not doing that. So people resist changing stories, right? They look for the facts that support their story. And so when you're dealing with that kind of dynamic, yeah, I agree with Rose. Maybe it's necessary, maybe third parties have to come in and do something. Laura, what were you going to say?
Thinking about that since the beginning of the class when you told your story about your job. I think it very much depends on the kind of conflict. If we are considering the conflict like that, and we have a lot of time, because we all think that climate change is something which is still far away. It's still not a terrible thing, because we don't feel it here much. We can spend a lot of time on discussing everyone's claims and trying to get closer to each other. But I agree with Rose that it's very good to do it with the involvement of the third party who can bring interpretation like the group does. Here is your, and here is your.
Okay, so combining these two ideas, starting with what Laura was saying, you need to have a dialogue, and the dialogue's purpose is not necessarily to diagnose the problem or to come up with a solution. It's to elicit frames. Then combining with what Rose said, why would people willingly do that? Well, they often don't. So do you need a really skilled intermediary that is able to help them have that discussion, maybe with a set of rules so that people can hear a story that's contradictory to what they believe? Okay, I like those ideas. Anything else? Just dialogue? Yeah.
Also working with a third party, they might be able to help you find some sort of common ground or common goal. Because sometimes people have a hard time, like when they're really set in their opinion, they have a hard time looking beyond that and seeing a way to work together for mutual benefit.
Okay. So maybe finding a common goal, or as Catherine will teach you later on, finding common interests can be facilitated by exploring framing differences, because frames may be a way to help us figure out what it is that we actually care about, as opposed to what it is that we state our position is. This is true. Israel did this because it's an aggressor. No, Israel did this because it's a victim. Aggressor, victim, aggressive, victim. If we just do that, we're never going to get anywhere. So maybe by eliciting frames, tell me about your story and your understanding of history, maybe we figure out a little bit more about what is motivating that party. So it can make good things happen later on. The point of the dialogue is not to make good things happen now, but to set some kind of stage or groundwork upon which a reframed conversation can take place. So what I'm saying is that the process required to manage conflicts related to framing cognitive differences are not the same as those that can be used to manage other types of conflict. And in particularly what I'm thinking of is the classic, think about the courtroom jury system in the United States. You have a plaintiff and you have a defendant. And what do you do in a courtroom before a judge and a jury? What does the management of conflict look like in that situation? Yeah.
Each person argues their side.
They argue their side based on what?
Their own frame.
Yeah, but what's the judge and the jury looking for? Based on the facts. So sure, in a courtroom, You're framing, you're telling a story. But it's the job of the judge and jury to listen really carefully and find contradictions and get to the truth, the facts underneath it, and then render a judgment. The defendant is lying. That Perry Mason moment, you won't know who Perry Mason is probably, but that moment when it's clear, I caught you in your lie and your contradiction, your frame is rendered illegitimate because I have found the truth. Something actually happened, and we do conflict resolution is based on the search for the truth and disposition of the conflict based on culpability of wrong. What do you do in this situation? Israeli people, let's go into court, and the Palestinians, let's go into court. Let's hear each of you tell your historical story about this conflict, what you think your grievance is, and then I will render a judgment. Ridiculous. Why? Because the difficult thing about frames is there is no truth. There's things that happen that are uncontested, people dying, missiles launched, wars fought, all sorts of those things are true. But the interpretation becomes so important. Whose land is this? What is the story of my people? You can't say there's an objective reality there. So something different has to happen when you're dealing with those kinds of conflicts. I don't think you read this for this time, but this class we've assigned this article by Pinkley and Northrup, I think it is, Northcroft, on negotiation. And basically, the way they think about negotiation is the way they're trying to frame negotiation and have you think about negotiation is, what are you doing when you're actually negotiating with someone? When Pataki is sitting down with who's the new head of the, I'm Cuomo. Yes, when Cuomo is sitting down with the new head of the,
It's Berlin. I think it's Berlin.
Berlin, and all the other stakeholders. What's actually going on? Well, these folks say it's a process of frame convergence, that we start with two different stories. And what is negotiation other than creating a new field of vision in which some of the anchors from which we tell stories are shared, maybe never totally shared, but negotiation is a process of bringing an issue into focus where instead of talking past each other, like in my climate change dialogue, we begin to talk with each other. And so think of that as reframing. That's the simple, beautiful antidote to framing conflicts, is sharing your story and then trying to reframe the conflict. I'll give you a couple really simple ways to do that. Imagine a wage dispute between the owner of a factory and workers. And the owner of the faculty can't get off the dime because the owner of the factory just says, giving a raise to these workers is going to cost me more money. It's going to increase my bottom line. It's going to make me unprofitable. I can't do it. Cost me money, increase the bottom line, unprofitable. Cost money, increase the bottom line, unprofitable. Can't do it. How could that be reframed to create a space for negotiation that didn't exist as long as that was the frame? How could you reframe a raise costs my workers a lot of money?
We could do year-end profit sharing.
You could do profit sharing. Okay, you're talking about kind of a structural form. I'm just talking about what's going on, not the solution, but how to think and frame that problem in a different way.
If you give your workers a raise, they'll be more productive and more happy, so you'll increase your output. So even if your bottom line is increasing, you'll still be profitable.
There you go. Right? So suddenly we went from complete frame discordance, there's nowhere to go, to reframing it and thinking, well, maybe the way to think of it is if they're happier, they'll be more productive. And can we look for studies that validate that, and maybe then that opens up a pathway for transformation. So thinking, just altering what's happening in here, can be the transformative link. Attributions. Change the attributions you apply to your enemy. Catherine Girard just gave Amy, hi Amy. Amy was in my class last year. So Amy just got a B- on her first paper in this class. And she and Catherine are, big conflict, right? Because Amy's frame for that is, what a jerk. Catherine's unhappy in her personal life, so she's taking it out on students, right? That frame is just going to fuel their conflict back and forth, and then Catherine may have a frame about Amy. She's another one of those lazy students that won't take responsibility for her actions. Nowhere to go if you're framing it that way. But maybe Amy can reframe and say, Professor Girard, I shouldn't see it as a penalty. She's trying to make me a better student. She's trying to make me more successful in my life. She's trying to teach me something, and I'm going to listen to the lesson in this renewed frame, and I'm going to try that much harder. Suddenly, there's avenues for them to work together, simply through a change in frame. That's why I love that Joseph Campbell quote, if you want to change the world, change your metaphor. That one I know I told you last time I was here. If you want to change the world, change your metaphor. So Campbell is operating from this social psychological perspective, because he's saying conflicts are nothing but the way we think of the world. They're nothing but stories. So conflict transformation is simply a matter of changing your story, changing the way you see things. It's the simplest and hardest thing in the world, right? Yeah.
But conflict is a story between the two parties. If one party changes the world, change the reason, how can they make the other party change the frame?
How can they make them change their frames?
No, make the other party.
So if we were in a conflict, how could I make you change your frame? So I'll go to Rose. First of all, it's unlikely that we're going to change our frames if we have a really difficult conflict if it's just you and I sitting in a room. So often these kinds of dialogues and processes of reframing require a third party. And third parties who are skilled in creating ground rules so people can tell their story, doing reflective listening, so we're forced to put ourselves in your shoes and say what, and reflect back what it is your story is, so I feel heard. But you bring up an important point. How can you make somebody change their frame? You can't. So conflict transformation, there's lots of things, there's thousands of things somebody can do to transform a conflict. But if you're dealing with somebody who is
Very
stubborn or maybe psychologically so wounded or hurt or traumatized by an experience, the first key in the door that you would turn in order to transform that conflict would not be to say, oh yeah, I know your family was just killed by this perpetrator. Just, if you want to change your world, change your metaphor. Just think about it in a different way. Instead of thinking an evil, I hate you, you're awful, think of them as they had a bad childhood and now you can forgive them. Maybe that will work for people who are particularly capable of that kind of transformation, but for most people it won't. So as a conflict analyst, you wouldn't say the first thing to do is address framing. You'd say the first thing that has to happen is either justice or emotional catharsis or something else has to happen first. And some people will never change their mind because they're stubborn or hurt. That's why intermediaries, we spend in this field a ton of time talking about intermediaries. We love intermediaries, and we act as if intermediaries can do anything. They can't. You know, Bill Zartman always talks about conflicts, right? We have escalation, and then de-escalation and settlement, and he talks about this point as being the herding stalemate, meaning there comes a point in every conflict that there's a herding stalemate that precedes de-escalation. But herding stalemates can last a long, long time, right? And herding stalemates only get transformed when A, people cognitively say, I'm better off cooperating and mutually working with the other side to de-escalate this conflict than I am in unilaterally fighting it, and many never get to that point. And B, Zartman says, hurting stalemates only happen when there's a better option, when there's something else on the table that will be a better reality for people. So there's no panacea here. Sometimes conflicts get stuck and this framing stuff makes sense, but there's only so much you can do. There was another comment or hand. Yeah?
I was just going to further drive the issue of the third party
Mm-hmm.
in that regard. I think most times, well, I don't know, but that's my view, that a third party would be able to see clearer what the other two people are not saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of, reframing the stance of a party
Mm-hmm.
to look at it slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
If the third party could, introduce such things.
Right.
Ideas would come into the minds of the warring parties.
Right.
And they would probably go away, think about it, see those other sides of the thing they hadn't seen because someone has introduced that.
Right.
And it might.
That's the hope. Have you ever done mediation training, Rose?
No.
You should. That's what you get trained to do when you go through mediation training. What do mediators do? They listen carefully to your story. And you tell a story in a way that may be provocative to the other side and may be all about blame and them and why they're bad and wrong. And skilled mediators take that story and reframe exactly as you're saying. So what you're trying to say is, for you, this has been an experience really about a loss of your own dignity. Yes, that's what it's about. And the skilled mediator now has bypassed the frame being, it's all about you being an evil person who did these things, and said, it's about your feeling a loss of dignity. That's your story? Yes, that's my story. I hear that. Do you hear that to the other side? I can hear that better than I can when they're yelling at me and telling their story in a different ways. So that's an excellent point. So reframing, incredibly powerful, sometimes even the analogies that we use. So my freedom fighter Contras, right? Freedom fighter is an analogy. We can simply change analogies to recast the way that we trigger our thoughts about a conflict. That can go in both directions. It can go in a destructive escalation direction, but it also can be in a constructive de-escalation direction. So I'll leave you with one last quote. Another one of my favorite quotes of all times by Jerome Bruner, who is a social psychologist out of Columbia University. And this particular one is from his books called Acts of Meaning, Acts, A-C-T-S, of Meaning. And I would argue that a requirement to have people be able to change their mind and engage in reframing and to work effectively with people when we're dealing with really deep stories, it's really, really hard to do. And it works best in organizations or societies that embrace what Bruner is defining as a democratic culture. And I love this definition of democratic culture. He says, I take open-mindedness to be a willingness to construe knowledge and values from multiple perspectives without loss of commitment to one's own values. Open-mindedness is the keystone of what we call a democratic culture. Does the Maxwell School have a democratic culture? Does your department have a democratic culture? Does the United States have a democratic culture? Do other countries have democratic cultures? Do families have democratic cultures? You're going to do anything to facilitate the ability to deal with framing, transformation, and reframing. It's creating a sense of a democratic culture. It's a willingness, a belief system, a framing system that teaches us that the ethical, good way to deal with diversity and conflicts is first to be willing to put yourselves into the shoes of those you're in a conflict with. Even if you fundamentally disagree with what they believe or despise them, we're always better off trying to see first what the world looks like from their point of view, because they all have a story. ISIS has a story. So if all we say is, yes, I'll tell you how to frame ISIS, they're evil. End of story. If that's all you do, there's only one pathway for conflict transformation that's possible, because there's only one thing you do with people that are evil: you kill them, you eliminate them. But you're never hurt by saying even ISIS has a story, and maybe my ability to negotiate, to contend, to struggle, to fight, will be enhanced if for a moment I say I'm willing to look at what it would be like to be that person. Doesn't mean that I'm losing my own values and moral bearing. That's not what it means. I can always step back. I'm just saying I'm willing to give it a try. But more often than not, if you do that, you are somehow transformed, right? Because you can never have the same conversation in the same way more than once. Every time we have a conversation to learn about another person, we're transformed somehow. And so why aren't we embracing that, right? Why do we resist it? And I think we resist it because there's another culture which says when people are wrong, they need to be labeled as wrong, and there's absolute rights and wrongs. And that, I would say, is something that the field of conflict transformation is pushing against all the time, pushing towards this and away towards this notion of absolutes. Do you have a comment?
I think that third-party involvement be effective in a way, but I just want to bring up the limitation of third-party. For example, just a simple example, I say my own story to my mom, and my brother says his own story to his mom, which is my mom, just my mom. But mom tries to listen both sides and never gonna mediate the two issues from different sides. And another example is the jury system you mentioned. It also has a limitation. Any side can influence the jury by reframing the fact that they want to deliver. So we often find some trials found to be wrong, decided different. It should have been decided reversely, but good lawyers reframe the facts to influence the jury, so they win the case. So I just want to bring up the
that is limited. And good lawyers are well-paid lawyers, which is why the justice system tends to favor people who have money, right? Because they know how to tell a story or find facts. Yes, limitations. And what you're learning in this class is one size does not fit all. You're not going to learn in this class, here's the secret to managing any conflict. It's framing. Whether it's framing or interest-based negotiation or nonviolent social movements or anything else you're going to learn about as a technique for managing conflict in this class, everyone has its limitation. And most importantly, the question is, what are the conditions and contexts of the particular conflict you're looking at? And how do those conditions and contexts suggest that one approach might be better than the others in this circumstance? That's what you're learning to do. That's what conflict analysis is. What is this conflict about? What is mainly driving it? And based on that analysis, which of these limited, flawed tools may best fit in this situation? Okay, and so this is just one tool. Okay, any final questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I really like the idea of open-mindedness because from my personal experience, for example, in general, I see the religions back home is so different that gives structure of people's mind and to be judgmental or just to be like seeing culture is very different just because of the religion. But once I come here and I study Native Americans history, how the religions take a part of many things in the world that created conflicts. So by feeling that in the perspective of become a religious person, then go out to realize and listening other people's experience about the religious system or political structures, it makes sense that to understand where there is no absolute truth about which one is better or which one is correct, but yeah, the willingness to see from different perspectives and feel it and put ourselves into positions which other people feel it in different experience. So I think it might be very constructive to see we are not the true person.
Yeah, it certainly can be. It can also be destructive, right? Sometimes you may be put in a room with somebody and you realize you hate them even more. So it's a tricky business, right? Contact and contact theory is this notion that changing worldviews and visions and narratives is achieved through contact. But contact has to be managed. Just because we have contact doesn't mean that we have a better story. But you're right. I said that why I'm here today is because of that climate change experience. I could go back even further in time, and I went away to high school, to prep school that had a lot of international students. And I remember as a really young kid being terrified going away to school, and I walked in my dorm room, and there's this Iranian kid my age. And it suddenly dawned on me, I'm going to be living with this Iranian native speaker, PARCC. And this is some kid from Concord, Massachusetts, who hadn't had a lot of exposure to difference. And I can tell you that that experience was formative for me, and maybe that's the one that set me off on this. I love this kind of stuff, because it was so to be challenged, and to hear that different narrative and have to make sense of that after a year, and we lived together the year after, I've never been the same since it, in a really positive way. So that's the great hope of this approach. Okay, see you guys. Thank you.